What if the most modern character in Pride and Prejudice is not the one who follows love, but the one who quietly chooses survival? Because that question alone already breaks something we rarely question when reading Jane Austen. We assume her world is about romance, about emotional truth, about the tension between pride and affection. But inside that assumption, there is a silent distortion. We are judging survival through the lens of desire. And that might be the first cognitive gap we need to open. In the world of Pride and Prejudice, marriage is not a metaphor. It is infrastructure. It is income, security, and social position compressed into one irreversible decision. And in that system, Charlotte Lucas is not an exception. She is a response. A rational adaptation inside a structure that rewards stability over sentiment. But here's the contradiction most readers miss. If Charlotte is unromantic, then what exactly are we calling romanticism? Is it emotional truth, or just privilege disguised as freedom? Because freedom to choose love only works when survival is already guaranteed. And that leads to a sharper question. What does it actually mean to choose wrong, in a world where every option carries structural cost? Charlotte's decision is often framed as compromise. But that framing hides something deeper. It assumes there was ever a safe, neutral choice available. There wasn't. Her world does not offer love without consequence or independence without risk. So her logic operates in a different register entirely: minimize instability, maximize predictability, secure long-term survival. This is where the memory fragment forms. A quiet domestic space. A stable household. No dramatic collapse. No visible rebellion. Just continuity. And that continuity becomes the symbol, not of passion fulfilled, but of uncertainty eliminated. And in that elimination, something unsettling emerges: peace without romance, but also peace without illusion. Now the escalation. If we shift scale from individual to system, Charlotte stops being a character and becomes a signal. A signal that the romantic framework we use to judge her might not be universal truth, but cultural privilege. Because in a society where economic security is uneven, emotional idealism is not always freedom. It can be risk disguised as purity. And here is the first revelation. The discomfort people feel toward Charlotte may not come from her decision itself, but from what her decision exposes. That romance, as we define it, depends on conditions she never had access to. But there is a deeper contradiction still unresolved. If survival logic looks cold, does that mean emotional logic is always true? Or are both simply responses to different levels of security? And now the consequence expands. If Charlotte is not wrong, then an entire moral hierarchy built around romantic fulfillment begins to weaken. The idea that love is the highest form of decision-making becomes less absolute, more conditional, more fragile than we admit. So the greater question remains suspended in the air, unresolved. If what we call romantic truth only exists under specific social conditions, then are we truly reading Austen's world through insight, or through projection? What happens when a society quietly rewards one kind of intelligence, while labeling the other as morally questionable? Because the deeper we move into Charlotte's logic, the more we realize this is no longer about one woman's decision. It becomes a question about what kinds of thinking are allowed to survive inside a structured world like the one inside Pride and Prejudice. Here is the shift in perspective. If Part 1 exposed survival as a hidden layer beneath romantic judgment, then now we have to ask something sharper. Who defines what counts as cold? And why does emotional interpretation get moral authority by default? The contradiction appears immediately. A decision made for stability is seen as lacking feeling. But a decision made for feeling is rarely judged for its instability. So the system is not neutral. It is asymmetrical in how it assigns moral weight. And that asymmetry creates the real tension around Charlotte Lucas. She is not simply reacting to pressure. She is navigating a world where pressure is the default condition. Marriage is not optional expression. It is economic architecture. And yet, the cultural lens applied to her still assumes emotional freedom as a baseline. That mismatch is where the misunderstanding begins. Now the scale shifts. From an individual choice, we move into a broader social mechanism. In Regency England, survival is not distributed evenly. It is filtered through class, gender, and timing. For many women, the difference between romantic choice and practical choice is not philosophy. It is outcome probability. And here is the memory fragment that anchors this shift: a quiet household where nothing dramatic happens, yet everything stabilizes. No public victory. No emotional climax. Just continuity maintained under constraint. That image carries more weight than it first appears, because stability itself becomes invisible labor. But then a contradiction surfaces again. If stability is the goal, why does it feel narratively unsatisfying? Why does the mind resist treating equilibrium as achievement? This is where the psychological layer opens. We are not only evaluating Charlotte. We are revealing something about the observer. The discomfort toward her decision may reflect an internal bias. We are trained to equate emotional intensity with meaning. If something does not feel transformative, we assume it is less valid. But Charlotte's logic does not optimize for emotional narrative. It optimizes for long-term predictability under uncertainty. And that creates a rupture between lived reality and interpretive expectation. Revelation begins to form here, slowly, almost uncomfortably. The real conflict is not Charlotte versus society. It is two competing definitions of rationality. One is emotional rationality, driven by desire and perceived authenticity. The other is structural rationality, driven by constraint and probability. And neither is fully wrong. But they cannot be judged by the same metric without distortion. Now the consequence deepens. If we accept both frameworks as valid, then moral judgment becomes unstable. What looks like compromise may actually be adaptation. What looks like clarity may actually be privilege. And suddenly, the hierarchy of right and wrong choices becomes less fixed than we want it to be. This is where Charlotte stops being an exception and starts becoming a mirror. Not of romance lost, but of how different environments produce different versions of rational behavior. And the greater question emerges, heavier now than before: if meaning itself changes depending on whether we prioritize emotion or survival, then which version of reality are we actually reading when we interpret human choice? And who benefits from keeping that question unresolved? At what point does a rational adaptation begin to look like a moral failure? And who gets to decide the boundary between the two? Because now the tension is no longer theoretical. It is structural. And the deeper we move, the more the system inside Pride and Prejudice stops behaving like a romantic narrative and starts revealing itself as a negotiation space between constraint and identity. There is a contradiction emerging that cannot be ignored. If survival logic is framed as cold, then emotional logic must be framed as free. But freedom only exists when the cost of choice is evenly distributed. And in this world, it is not. So we must ask a harder question. What does emotional authenticity even mean when the consequences of being authentic are structurally unequal? Charlotte Lucas begins to function less like a character and more like a stress test for interpretation itself. Her decisions do not escalate drama. They reduce uncertainty. And in a narrative culture that equates meaning with intensity, reduction feels like absence. But absence is not nothing. It is control. And here is where the escalation begins. If we zoom out, the entire social environment stops appearing as a backdrop and becomes an active pressure system. Every choice is filtered through visibility, reputation, and long-term viability. Even silence becomes strategic. Memory fragment, a quiet domestic space that does not signal romance, but signals continuity. No rupture. No collapse. Only stability that is rarely recognized as achievement because it does not produce spectacle. And yet, that stability carries weight. Because it suggests that survival is not passive. It is constructed. Maintained. Chosen repeatedly under constraint. Now the contradiction intensifies. If Charlotte's logic is survival-based intelligence, why does it provoke discomfort rather than respect? The answer may not lie in her actions, but in what her actions expose about the observer. We are beginning to see a psychological inversion. The more a decision aligns with structural reality, the less emotionally satisfying it becomes. Meaning is being measured not by accuracy, but by narrative resonance. This creates a fracture. A split between lived reality and interpreted morality. And inside that fracture, Charlotte becomes a symbol of something larger, the conflict between systems that reward emotional legibility and systems that demand practical adaptation. Scales shifts again. From individual cognition to cultural programming. Romantic frameworks often prioritize visibility of feeling over invisibility of strategy. But survival systems do the opposite. They prioritize outcomes over expression. When these two logics collide, one is labeled noble and the other is labeled suspect. But that labeling itself is not neutral. It is a form of narrative governance. And now the revelation begins to destabilize further. If emotional judgment depends on visibility, then the most rational choices may always appear the least human within romantic storytelling. Not because they lack humanity, but because they lack theatrical expression. This is where consequence expands beyond Charlotte. It suggests that entire interpretive traditions may be biased toward rewarding emotionally readable decisions, even when those decisions are structurally fragile. So we are left with a deeper tension. If rationality is punished by perception, and emotion is rewarded by narrative, then what kind of truth are we actually preserving when we call a character right or wrong? And beneath that question, something more unsettling starts to form, still incomplete, still unresolved. What if the real conflict is not between Charlotte and her world, but between two incompatible ways of defining what a human decision even is, and what happens when neither definition is fully allowed to dominate? What if the most important realization about Charlotte Lucas is not what she chose, but what her choice reveals about how meaning itself is constructed inside a social system like the one embedded in Pride and Prejudice? Because at this point, something fundamental begins to surface. Not as interpretation, but as structure. Revelation emerges here. Charlotte is not operating outside the romantic system. She is exposing its hidden dependency on stability that it refuses to acknowledge. The system celebrates emotional spontaneity, yet quietly relies on people who ensure continuity when spontaneity fails. That contradiction is not incidental. It is foundational. And this is the turning point. What looks like compromise is actually functional alignment with an underlying social architecture. Charlotte does not reject romance. She relocates its importance. She treats it as secondary to survival continuity, not because she lacks emotion, but because she recognizes hierarchy and consequence. Memory fragment, a quiet household where emotional intensity is absent, but structural predictability is present. No dramatic peaks. No narrative spectacle. Yet life continues without collapse. That continuity becomes the invisible framework holding instability away. Now the deeper insight unfolds. Emotional visibility is not the same as emotional truth. What is seen is not always what is most structurally significant. And in a system where visibility determines moral judgment, structural intelligence becomes misread as emotional absence. That misreading is the core distortion. Charlotte's role, then, is not symbolic of surrender. It is symbolic of recalibration. She operates within a system that rewards emotional expressiveness in theory, but rewards economic stability in practice. And she chooses alignment with practice over narrative idealism. But here is where consequence begins to expand beyond the character. If one individual's rational adaptation is consistently interpreted as moral deficiency, then the system is not evaluating behavior. It is evaluating conformity to a storytelling framework. And that changes everything. Scales shifts outward. This is no longer about one woman or one decision. It becomes a model for how societies interpret legitimacy. Systems that privilege emotional readability will consistently misunderstand structural intelligence. And systems that prioritize structural intelligence will often appear emotionally hollow to outside observers. Memory fragment, A stable life that does not announce itself as meaningful, yet prevents collapse through quiet continuity. That image is not dramatic, but it is functional. And function, in this context, carries hidden weight. Now the consequence deepens further. If meaning is assigned based on emotional visibility, then entire categories of survival behavior risk being misclassified as ethical deviation. This creates a blind spot where necessity is mistaken for lack of virtue. And that blind spot is not neutral. It shapes how narratives are built, how characters are judged, and how cultural memory decides what is admirable. So we reach a structural revelation: Charlotte is not an anomaly within the romantic world. She is evidence that the romantic world itself requires an unseen support layer that it does not fully acknowledge or honor. And now the question expands beyond literature into interpretation itself. If every system that values emotional truth also depends on invisible structures of stability, then what happens when those structures are no longer recognized as meaningful? Is meaning still meaning when it depends on something it refuses to see, or does it quietly transform into something else entirely without us noticing? What if the real message hidden beneath Charlotte Lucas is not about choice, not about morality, and not even about survival, but about how entire systems quietly define what meaningful life is allowed to look like? Because once that question is fully formed, everything begins to reorganize. At the deepest level of Pride and Prejudice, there is a structural truth that rarely gets spoken directly. Human value is constantly filtered through visibility, narrative appeal, and emotional readability. And Charlotte does not disrupt that system. She exposes it by failing to perform according to its expectations. Core revelation arrives here. Charlotte Lucas is not a deviation from romantic logic. She is what romantic logic looks like when stripped of aesthetic privilege. She is the same decision-making framework, but without the luxury of ideal conditions. What changes is not her reasoning, but the environment in which her reasoning is judged. Memory fragment. A life that does not present itself as dramatic, yet continues steadily in the background, unrecognized not because it lacks meaning, but because meaning has been socially assigned to more visible forms of emotional expression. And that is where the real structure reveals itself. The romantic worldview does not simply celebrate love. It prioritizes narratable emotion. It elevates decisions that can be emotionally framed, visually interpreted, and culturally celebrated. But survival intelligence rarely fits into that frame. It operates in continuity, not climax. In stability, not spectacle. Insight expansion becomes unavoidable. If emotional expressiveness is treated as the highest indicator of authenticity, then any form of intelligence that minimizes emotional volatility will always appear morally inferior within that interpretive system. Not because it is inferior, but because it is less narratively legible. Charlotte, in this sense, becomes a mirror that reflects the limits of interpretation itself. Now consequence emerges with greater weight. The more a society relies on narrative coherence to assign moral value, the more it risks misclassifying adaptive intelligence as emotional absence. And over time, this creates a cultural blind spot where survival-based reasoning is systematically undervalued, not because it is ineffective, but because it does not produce emotionally satisfying stories. Scales shifts outward again. This is no longer about one character within a literary world. It becomes a model for how civilizations encode value. When storytelling becomes the primary framework for moral judgment, reality itself begins to get filtered through emotional design rather than structural accuracy. Memory fragment. Stability that does not announce itself, continuity that does not perform, a life that does not break into dramatic arcs yet sustains itself quietly against uncertainty. That fragment carries a meaning that is easy to overlook, because it does not demand attention. And this is where the philosophical tension sharpens. If the most structurally intelligent decisions are the least narratively rewarding, then what does that imply about the way meaning is constructed in human culture? Are we rewarding truth, or are we rewarding interpretability? Because if interpretability becomes the standard, then entire layers of reality remain invisible simply because they do not translate well into emotional narrative form. And now the consequence deepens into something harder to ignore. Charlotte Lucas stops being a case study in pragmatism and becomes evidence of a systemic bias in perception itself. A bias that rewards emotional clarity over structural necessity, even when structural necessity determines survival outcomes. So the final question does not resolve. It expands. If meaning is shaped more by how a decision feels than by what a decision actually does, then how much of what we call moral understanding is truly perception, and how much of it is simply storytelling that has learned to forget its own limits? What remains when a decision is no longer judged as right or wrong, but as necessary within a system that never asked for emotional permission in the first place? Because at this point, the consequence is no longer theoretical. It is historical. Inside Pride and Prejudice, the presence of Charlotte Lucas is not a disruption of the romantic order. It is the afterimage of what that order excludes in order to remain emotionally coherent. The consequence is subtle but irreversible. Once survival-based reasoning is framed as emotional deficiency, a culture begins to misread its own stabilizing mechanisms. The people who maintain continuity are no longer recognized as part of the emotional architecture of society. They become invisible by definition, not by accident. Memory fragment, a quiet, stable domestic life that does not demand attention, yet quietly prevents collapse from becoming visible. No dramatic resolution, no narrative reward, only continuity that holds everything together without recognition. That fragment does not exist as symbolism alone. It represents a structural cost. The cost of emotional storytelling as a dominant moral lens is that it selectively highlights intensity while erasing maintenance. And maintenance is where most real systems survive. Expansion follows naturally. If meaning is consistently assigned to what can be emotionally narrated, then entire categories of human intelligence are filtered out of cultural memory. Not because they fail, but because they do not translate into dramatic arcs. Charlotte becomes a template for this exclusion. Not as a victim of misunderstanding, but as proof of a hidden hierarchy of perception. And this creates a deeper legacy. The legacy is not Charlotte as a character. It is Charlotte as a pattern. A cognitive pattern where adaptive rationality is continuously reclassified as emotional absence whenever it does not align with aesthetic expectations. Over time, this pattern reshapes interpretation itself. It trains readers to value visibility over function, expression over stability, narrative clarity over structural truth. Now the scale shifts outward again. This is no longer about literary interpretation. It becomes a commentary on how societies encode value into behavior. When emotional readability becomes the dominant filter for judgment, systems begin to favor actions that can be seen over actions that are necessary but invisible. And here is where the tension intensifies. Because a society that rewards visibility over function will always produce narratives that feel meaningful, even when they overlook the mechanisms that make meaning possible in the first place. Memory fragment, continuity without applause, stability without recognition, a life that does not escalate into story but quietly prevents breakdown from becoming reality. That image carries a quiet contradiction. It is essential, yet it rarely becomes the center of attention. Reflection deepens here. If interpretive systems consistently overlook structural intelligence, then what they call truth may actually be a filtered version of reality shaped by emotional accessibility. And if that is the case, then entire layers of human behavior remain permanently misclassified, not because they are misunderstood, but because they are not narratively convenient. This is Charlotte's lasting effect. Not transformation, not resolution, but exposure. She exposes the gap between what is necessary and what is narratively visible. And that gap does not close. It expands across interpretation itself. So the consequence extends beyond her world. It suggests that every system of meaning built on emotional legibility carries an inherent blind spot. It cannot fully account for the intelligence required to maintain what it celebrates. And now the final question begins to surface, heavier than before, unresolved in a deeper way than any single interpretation can contain. If the invisible work of stability is always reclassified as absence, then what else in human understanding is quietly sustaining everything we value? while remaining permanently unreadable to the stories we choose to believe? When a story stops being about who is right or wrong, and starts revealing the invisible logic that shaped every so-called choice, what remains is not judgment, but recognition. At the end of Pride and Prejudice, Charlotte Lucas no longer functions as a character inside a narrative conflict. She becomes something more unsettling, a reference point for how meaning is assigned after the fact. Not by the people living inside the system, but by those interpreting it from a distance. Final insight emerges here. Human beings rarely evaluate decisions in isolation. They evaluate them through the emotional language available to them. And when that language prioritizes visibility, intensity, and romantic coherence, then entire forms of intelligence that operate through restraint, predictability, and structural awareness become almost impossible to recognize as meaningful. Memory fragment. A quiet, stable life that does not announce itself, does not escalate into dramatic resolution, yet continues to hold together everything that would otherwise fall apart. Its significance is not in what it expresses, but in what it prevents. That is Charlotte's legacy. Not rebellion. Not tragedy. But function without narrative reward. And this is where the deeper human meaning settles. People are not only shaped by the choices they make. They are shaped by the interpretive systems that define how those choices will be remembered. In one system, emotional risk becomes virtue. In another, structural caution becomes wisdom. The same action can shift meaning entirely depending on which language of value is applied afterward. But here is the philosophical fracture that remains unresolved. If meaning depends on interpretation, and interpretation depends on what can be emotionally seen, then what happens to everything that sustains life without ever becoming visible enough to be named as meaningful? The legacy of Charlotte Lucas is not that she challenges romance. It is that she exposes the limits of how romance can be used as a lens for judgment at all. She reveals that emotional legibility is not the same as truth, and that what feels narratively complete is not always what is structurally real. And that leaves a quieter, more persistent tension underneath everything. Because the more we rely on emotionally coherent stories to understand human behavior, the more we risk overlooking the systems, choices, and forms of intelligence that never translate into story at all. Memory fragment. A life that does not appear in dramatic arcs, yet quietly maintains continuity where instability would otherwise take over. Its presence is not remembered as significance, but it is felt as absence only when it is gone. So the final reflection is not about Charlotte as a historical figure inside fiction. It is about what she represents in the act of interpretation itself, the possibility that some of the most essential forms of human reasoning will never fully fit inside the stories we are most comfortable telling. And if that is true, then the question that remains is not what Charlotte Lucas chose, but whether our definition of meaning is large enough to ever recognize the intelligence of what does not ask to be seen.